dark. This gives you a little bit more of a foundation for when you begin to take that final darkest detail color, which I'm about to do on mine. It gives you a good neutral ground to provide some of that real subtle stuff in there with the black as well.
Okay.
Come on, man. You can do it, man. Those look good. Keep them up. Then you need to probably thin your paint down just a little bit, or what's happening is you're not quite confident enough to put it down and you're just blowing too much air and you're not putting enough paint. So go ahead and start getting some of those bubbles over there. I've got a mixture that's almost 100%. It's probably about 90% as far as a gradient scale would be relative from 0 to 100 being, you know, solid black, 0 being solid white. I'm probably about 80 to 90% right now. I mean, it looks almost pure black, but it's actually still pretty gray. So, with that in mind, I went in and I buzzed in some of the neutral details, and I take advantage of the gray to, as yesterday we talked about level of contrast affecting the appearance of things being in the foreground, things being in the background. Now, if something's off in the distance, like for example on yours, Larry, the islands and stuff like that, you might even want to go with a little bit lighter gray if you feel you need to establish any more detail, but I would be real careful on how much detail you put in, you know, period, because it's going to help set up that atmospheric perspective that we try to achieve, the, you know, things in foreground and background. So you can see here, like over here on this horn here, I just went in real lightly with the gray and kind of filled in the area, and it helps to kind of establish a little bit of a difference. It's almost artificially pushing it back further than it really is, but I'm exaggerating that in order to enhance things coming more in the foreground. So you can play with these concepts, you can play with the ideas of the value and the levels of contrast to really kind of almost like sometimes when people do photography with those fisheye lenses, how things immediately in the foreground and then how quickly things will kind of fuzz out around the sides and stuff like that. You can utilize that a lot of times when you're creating stuff to have more of a dramatic impact. Okay, now I'm going to keep working in the dark areas. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start right here in the, this area right around here. And then the hat area. And I'm just going to use some shielding, grab whatever I have. I thought I had one of those. Oh, there it is. Alright, so I made like a little curve here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to define that shadow. And you can really see how much difference in the level of value, even as subtle as it may seem, you can really pick that out in comparison to this gray that we had just previously used, and certainly adjacent to the highlights that we started off with. So now I'm going to more or less stay working in the darker areas of this painting, and I will start to bring some of this stuff around even more dramatically up and around this eye area here. But I'm not going over everything, you know, like we talk about not wanting to overwork our painting, and this is where it really begins to happen when people are doing this stuff. See, like even those areas where we've got the darkest stuff, and what I'll do is I'm going to continue down a lot of the details through there, and I'm adding a lot of little elements there that weren't necessarily done with the white, but it's continuing that terrain or that surface texture down into the areas where the core shadow primarily exists, dividing this lighted surface here from the lighted surface down below in the gum line. So each time you're working with these darker colors, because you're working, over top of things successfully, as they graduate a little bit darker, you can add a lot of this stuff in the details. And some of it isn't going to have a whole lot of details. Sometimes it's just going to be muted out completely, like up in here where there's going to be really not a whole lot of light activity going on because of the shape of the object. So this is just going to get blasted in nice and evenly. except where I want to add like some other details heading out towards the edge of the lighting there. So you can see that we can control a lot of the dramatic contrast with this particular level of color, this value of gray. And the most impact that we're going to get out of this is right at the very end when we start to come back in with our highlights. But working with these colors, you want to reestablish, or with this value of gray, you want to reestablish your core shadows. Make sure that you got those giving that dimension to your objects that you want. And you start to see how this is really starting to develop a lot more dimension. Even though the white, as much as I tried to attack it and give it the final result that I was looking for, it makes, even with a little bit more of these colors and the values of grays on there, you can see how much more detail is added to it. But I'm never really changing the original white that I put down. I'm not really deviating from that. I'm always kind of working within the boundaries of where I was starting off with this project with the white.
So for someone who was not as experienced, do you think it's best to go to work in grayscale?
I think it gives you a better understanding of some of the most fundamentals of good solid design, dealing with contrast and more of content and maybe composition, because so many times color can clutter what the real visual could be, the strength of it. And it's a lot easier to get, I think, if you can make an image look good with the gray, you can make an image look that much more solid with the color once you know what you're doing. But dealing with contrast, light. So many people can confuse light with color, and how brilliant maybe saturation and stuff. So working like this on a black surface, I think, familiarizes us more with the way light plays on a surface, rather than the way line and contrast interact as far as like working on a lighter surface with a darker color. And I think that makes it more of an understanding of what's going on dealing with light and not so much shape and defined by outline or perimeter. So yeah, I think that it's a good way for guys to start out and not, because I could easily come in here now with a color wash and slightly wash some tones in there if I wanted to and not really change anything I've done. The values are still going to be there, which is what is really giving us the sense of shape and form, not defined by color. So, when you come back in with these darker colors, don't feel like you got to go over everything. You see how subtle all this stuff is here that I'm working through here in the eye. And even in the negative space, I've come back in with this darker tone in some of these areas that I want to define and carry that, detail down through there and stuff. But don't go back over top of all your white. Don't go back in and get carried away with that, because you just destroy all the hard work that you put in with your white. So even a lot of the stuff that I'm doing here, I'm keep in mind where the light's coming from, and I'm just enhancing that whole concept that we started off with. Some of the strokes that I'm using are really soft, non-defined, but around these teeth, I'm basically doing a flood stroke. And what that kind of means in terms, for those of you who are not familiar with how I use that term, it's like when I'm basically coming in there and I'm powering it on to the point where it's almost running out the sides, I'm trying to put down as much color in as little area as possible before the point where the air pressure blows out the paint. And it's almost like using a Sharpie to some extent to outline this definition. And right here in the recesses of the gums here, I'm using that quite a bit. You can see what a difference that makes from here over to here on this side of my image. It just gives it a little bit more of a definition, making it feel like those teeth are kind of popping into the gum line a little bit. And if you use that darkest area right up against your lightest area, that level of contrast, that interaction of the extreme light versus the darker colors, it is, as much as it may be artistically enhanced, is going to provide you with a little bit more dynamic focus because of the level of contrast, as we've been discussing with using your values and the contrast to give a relative story of perspective and distance in your objects and stuff like that. So use that creatively along with your painting to help, make something a little bit more dynamic. Copying the stuff from photographs and stuff won't necessarily give you that same opportunity to be creative with some of the fundamentals of light and contrast. But when you're creatively doing stuff out of your imagination, it goes pretty smooth, and you got a little bit of headroom that you can exaggerate a situation, beyond what you would consider to be acceptable or believable. But that's okay in a somewhat imaginary world where this guy doesn't necessarily exist. So you can kind of see now the real strong highlights that we had up against the teeth, and how the strength of that black line right through there complemented each other to the point now those teeth have come out even that much more forward. So thinking in terms of what you guys are working on with the individual projects, what do you want the focus to be? What is it that you want people to see most in your object? How can you bring that to have more impact? And you can do that with the contrast. You can do that with a level of detail and changing things around from being somewhat subdued in the background to more focused in the front, like I was talking to you, John, about defining the edges of your object a little bit more and stuff. So that's how I creatively use all these things to, create this little world that exists in my head, and it's observation, and there's a lot of ways to, see that in real life too, but the fundamentals are hard to just look at and understand, when you're just looking at a photograph. It just takes time and practice before you understand them and can apply them to your own artwork, And I just keep drilling the stuff into your head here for the next 2 days too, so you guys really begin to see, where you can make changes. Because if you go home and work from a photograph, you're only going to see the real world the way it exists, and you don't have the opportunity, if you're trying to duplicate something, sometimes to enhance something to provide more visual entertainment, more visual bullshit for the viewer, So that's kind of like how I'm thinking. You can see just this little area. I'm pretty much done here except for the highlights right through this area. And it'll probably take me another 20 or 30 minutes that I will kind of bust through in the next couple hours to finish this up. And then the last thing I'm going to be doing is the highlights. So just remember, don't go back in and wipe out everything you've done when you start getting these colors. Keep working in that negative space. Just keep focusing on the areas where you don't have the white. All right? So let's just keep rocking and rolling.